And welcome everybody into the Mind Sculptors. I am your host, Caleb, also known as Callahan. And joining me again today is my good friends Cobblepott and Pongo. How are you guys doing today?
Good to be here.
Yeah, good to be back. Doing well tonight.
Yeah. So before we even jump in, because we're doing a Commander Legends set review, I know I'm going to get comments. I'm recording this a little bit before it comes out. So my microphone in the last video was disastrously bad. So what had happened is earlier in the day, I had unplugged my laptop and was sitting in the living room with my fiance, and we were watching election results together, and I was just on my computer. When I came back in and plugged my computer in, it didn't default back to my microphone, and so everything that you heard was recorded off my computer's PC microphone. So that was why my voice sounded like I was 9 miles away. So.
And it doesn't have a pop filter?
No, it didn't have a pop filter, believe it or not.
You know, you could just try to overdub the entire thing. All 1.5 to 2 hours of it.
Right.
Just, script it out and
overdubbed our voices too, using
I'll just try to do my best Cobblepott and Pongo impersonation.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I could do that. I just have to make my voice deep for Pongo. So, so we're talking about Commander Legends today, and we're going to talk about quite a few cards that are coming out, and specifically in how they're going to be impacting cEDH. And probably just starting off right off the bat, might as well get the big one out of the way, right? The good old pushed Aven Mind Sensor Opposition Agent. If you haven't got a chance yet to see what Opposition Agent is, it's 2 colorless and a black creature with flash. You control your opponents while they're searching their libraries. While an opponent is searching their library, they exile each card they find. You may play those cards for as long as they remained exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. And on top of it's a 3/2. I'm genuinely surprised this thing does not have flying, honestly.
I mean, Aven Mind Sensor has flying.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much to unpack with this thing. Just what are our thoughts on this?
I mean, I think the first thing right off the bat is a lot of people are going to compare it to Aven Mind Sensor just because it's the same casting cost. It has flash. It hates on tutors. And those are, all noteworthy similarities, but I think that's where the similarities end. You look at the patterns of play, and you look at the implications of getting caught by, one of these coming down. In the case of an Aven Mind Sensor, when you lead out with a tutor and somebody catches you with an Aven Mind Sensor, it's like, oops, oh well, it's like your spell got maybe your spell got countered, or maybe your fetch turns out to be a fail to find or something like that. And that's kind of it. You shrug your shoulders and you move forward. This is really effectively a Praetor's Grasp when it resolves and stays on the table. So in that case, depending on how it is that you built your deck, you can get into a circumstance if you've been greedy with your deck design. And for instance, if Thassa's Oracle is your only win con, and your deck is just really, really optimized on all the different layers and ways that you can get to your Oracle and get it down as efficiently and as consistently as possible. And if somebody can snag that, then you're in a really difficult position. So I think that the implications here are twofold. One is there's the possibility that its existence will cause people to change or adjust their deck building to maybe not as greedy in their focus around singular win cons. And I think that one's going to be less of an impact. I think the bigger impact that you're going to see, the thing that's going to be more prominent, is there'll be a shift in gameplay. People will be less cavalier about leading out with a tutor if they don't have protection for the tutor, or they don't have a counterspell that can deal with a creature, especially when somebody has 2 and a black open.
Yeah, that's an important point. People holding up 2 and a black, or well, I mean,
it doesn't even need to be that.
2 and a maybe a rainbow land. Essentially, if they're representing 2 and a black, then you have to respect the possibility that opposition agent is coming down. I had this situation come up in a game recently on stream, where one of my opponents passed with 2 and possibly a black up. It was a rainbow land, and I was like, okay, well, I guess this is it. Like, we're finally gonna see this card in action, aren't we? So I opted to not use my fetch land and instead pitch it to my Mox Diamond in that position, when otherwise I probably would have fetched for a land that I wanted a little bit more than the land that I ended up playing out. Turns out that the card was an Aven Mind Sensor, so it wouldn't have been nearly as bad had it come down, but
wouldn't have been great, but
still bad, right? You always had to respect Aven Mind Sensor, but the thing about Aven Mind Sensor hitting a fetch land is that, like, if that's just a strip mine, it's not necessarily like game over for you right away. Whereas this, kind of like what Cobblepott was getting at, is as you're reading this card, essentially the impression you're getting is that it's like there's one more thing, and there's one more thing, but wait, there's one more thing. Not only is this everything that Cobblepott mentioned, there was so many opportunities to kind of, I guess, like, tweak this card a little bit so it was not quite as stupid as it actually is. So not only does it do everything that Cobblepott mentioned, but in addition to that, you don't actually need to have opposition agent in play to be able to play the card after. So if you get a card off of it, your opponent tutors and you manage to successfully take control of them during that period and exile a card, if opposition agent gets killed later, you still get access to that card in exile. Additionally, there's one more thing. It color strips the card. So it's not even like Praetor's Grasp where you have to like pay the mana cost, like the colored cost. It color strips for you. So your Thassa's Oracle that you stole costs 2 colorless mana. You can play it off of a Soul Ring instead of playing it off of mana blue. Crypt. Yeah, you can play it off your mana crypt for 2 blue. So like I said, there's always one more thing with this card that just makes it even stupider than it seems at first glance.
There was a question that came up at one point, and I never actually heard what the answer was because there wasn't a judge in the room. But the situation is somebody was able to land an opposition agent and then steal a card, and then somebody Gilded Draked the opposition agent, and people weren't sure. It's like, well, now that control of the opposition agent has shifted from one player to another, does the original player still retain that that hidden card, or does the owner, if opposition agent is still in play, does the current owner get that control?
So other cards that have a similar effect, right? I'm struggling to think of some.
Like Gonti, yeah. That's
like Gonti, yeah.
Easiest one to think of.
Don't do that. But they also have this conditional piece to it, right? Where it's you may play this for as long as you control this, right? This specifies you may play. In that, it is not a. So if it was an effect where you were effectively putting it underneath an opposition agent, right, where you were like exiling underneath of it, you would probably see something where you could play something like that. But it would not. I don't think it changes owners. Opposition agent opens up a lot of really tricky judge questions as a judge, and some of that is going to be what do the release notes say?
That makes sense.
And so a lot of these questions like this are going to be pure speculation until those release notes drop. Because any judge who will sit here and tell you for sure how that works is talking out of their ass, honestly, because they don't know. We could get the release notes and find out that it doesn't work that way. But my estimation based on how other similar effects work is that it would not change ownership.
Okay.
Well, so it's interesting because you don't own the card that gets exiled either. They exile the card, right? So they still have that card in exile. And I think that's where it becomes an interesting question, like what Cobble was getting at.
The word "you," because you control the word "you" changes owner, or controller.
It's a static ability, right? It's not like a trigger.
And I think there is some sort of time stamping with it. All these effects have some time stamping thing that's attached to them that makes it very strange. It's just the whole thing is weird, and I really hate design like this because it just opens up a can of worms like this that, unless you specifically think about those in the design, are just going to make some very, very annoyed judges
or
extensive rulings lists.
Right. Yeah, from my perspective, not a judge, but someone who's very interested in the rules of Magic for clear reasons. I'm like okay with designs like this, at least in theory, not the specific design in this case. I think this card is pushed way too far, but I think most of us can agree to that. However, the way I've always looked at Magic is kind of the idea that all the rules are sort of on the cards. And then, at least in spirit, there's like kind of a few basic rules to the game. Now, in truth, there's a massive list of comprehensive rules, and Magic is incredibly complex. But like to grasp Magic and to play it, you don't actually need to know all the comprehensive rules. It really, when you're playing it just as a player, it feels like all the rules are kind of on the cards. And this feels kind of, like it's a bold step towards expanding that space where there's just new rules being printed on a new card.
Well, and part of my issue with the design, too, is the you control your opponent's aspect of it. I generally
look at their hand and other game actions.
I generally don't like, generally speaking, mind slaver like effects. Outside of the it feels bad thing. As a judge, it opens up a lot of opportunities for problematic play. Where there are plenty of times where somebody's like, I think a great example of this is in tournaments, where somebody's playing like Blue Tron, right? And one of the wins with that is you mind slaver lock people. And before you get the lockdown, I've had to issue penalties for people incorrectly playing things as the mind slaver. And so anytime there is something where it's like you pick up your opponent's deck and search for something, I'm generally like, I don't love that. It just opens up a lot of really icky play things. And I think specifically this is less of a problem in a digital space, because then you don't have the cheating aspect of it and all those things.
Although
it does.
It depends on the digital space in question, right? Because if you're playing over webcam, this introduces a ton of new problems.
Resolving
cards like Praetor's Grasp, resolving cards like this over webcam, which I think increasingly going forward is a style of gameplay that Wizards is interested in supporting. It's really difficult. It's quite awkward to do that, especially in multiplayer. Single player, it's one thing, but in multiplayer, Praetor's Grasp is very awkward to resolve. Actually, Praetor's Grasp is still awkward to resolve in single player over webcam, because that card is supposed to be hidden to the person whose deck it belongs to.
So this does not have that. So it's going to be exiled face up, so people will know what it is that you took. So that's at least a little bit easier.
Right. Well, I'm sure we could continue talking about that card for an entire episode.
I do want to touch on just one other aspect of it, and that's how it's going to, another way that it's going to impact gameplay. So, I mean, yes, it's definitely going to make people think or be a lot more cautious before, committing to tutors in game. But the same way that people currently, a lot of people who play cEDH kind of have a sixth sense with Notion Thief. They can look at somebody who's in dimmer colors and be able to see 4 mana open. You can kind of
sense it out.
Right,
Yeah.
you can kind of tell that there's a Notion Thief on its way. This is going to have kind of a similar characteristic, where Notion Thief doesn't see as much play because it excels in places where people are weaponizing wheels and things like that. People don't really use Notion Thief just as kind of a hate bear. They don't use it. They're going to use it when they can exploit it. As far as it can go. This, on the other hand, the ceiling is so high and doesn't require extra pieces. You don't have to be playing like a wheels game. You don't have to be on a certain game plan to have an extremely high ceiling with the card. I think it's going to see near universal play, especially at the beginning when everyone's testing it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what you're going to have happen is, even when people don't have it, if they don't have a better thing that they can be doing, it's going to be profitable to bluff that they do have it.
Right.
And there's one more thing, it's as you were saying, it's Stranglehold at instant speed for 1 less mana.
Right.
Obviously, it's missing 1 line of text, but who cares?
Might as well read that way.
Beyond that, like you were saying, it's not just a hate bear. It's also, it can be a value play in a lot of cases. And so, unlike a card like Aven Mind Sensor, which I think is generally just going to slow down the game, and ideally you're going to take advantage of that. And usually that's pretty easy because it's asymmetrical and it does something pretty disruptive. This is, if you time it correctly, or if you're lucky enough to be able to catch someone unawares, it's going to just win the game for you on the spot. So it's not as much of a pure hate bear. It's also a card that you just kind of can happily jam into your deck for value, even if you're on a proactive strategy, because everyone's playing tutors.
And everybody who is on dimmer has a pretty strong incentive to be on Oracle and Tainted Pact or Consultation in some shape or form. So because everybody is in that same boat, you can look at it as kind of this asymmetric, anti-tutor that becomes a tutor for your win con.
Right.
I mean, it's the best of both worlds, and it's going to be the card that everyone has in hand, even when they don't have it in hand. I think is what it's going to be.
Yeah, and a lot of times, even in the worst case scenario, is you can just find like a tutor from their deck and cast that on your turn. You essentially countered one of their spells, played a hate piece, and then also sort of drew a really strong card while you were at it. So that's just that's the ceiling of the card right there.
So
good card.
Moving on to the next hate bear that's really pushed and is a better version of a different card effectively. We've got Hull Breacher. It's 2 colorless mana and a blue. Also, it's a Merfolk Pirate who's a 3/2. It has Flash. If an opponent would draw a card except the first one, they draw in each of their draw steps. Instead, you create a treasure token. So, to summarize so that we can simplify it, this is Notion Thief, but instead of drawing the cards, you make treasure. So this is a card that a lot of people have kind of immediately recognized that it plays the same role of LED and these Underworld Breach and Wheel of Fortune loops, but you don't lose your hand, and you're also taking everybody else off their hands. This card is another card that's just insane.
Right. I think that it's for the decks that are trying to weaponize wheels, your Opus Thief kind of variation decks. It's a slam dunk, and it will only improve those game plans. For the decks like you're saying that are on Breach, it's another redundant piece with LED that is actually more secure than, if you got LED with Wheel of Fortune or something like that, you better have a Grand Abolisher or a Silence Effect or something that is keeping your opponents from interacting with you, because if you're using a wheel to populate your graveyard, everybody else is seeing all of their cards too.
Even LED and Brain Freeze, right? Because you always just kind of run the risk of getting like Abrupt Decay or something like that.
Right. So in this particular case, it's taking it's hellbending everybody else at the table and netting you way more mana than LED does. So it's mana positive with each wheel.
By a lot, actually.
Oh yes, right. So
and you're getting 21 mana a wheel.
Yes, if it's Wheel of Fortune. Yes.
Right.
So it's just a crazy good card. I think that currently the Opus Thief decks that you see dip into white because you got Smothering Tithe and you got Alms Collector, and in order to kind of have the critical mass that you need of pieces that can exploit or profitably give you breaking of parity with wheel effects, you kind of needed to go into white. I think the presence of this can, on the one hand, make it feasible to play that same game plan, dropping white and just going into Grixis. Or it also allows what I think is probably a more reasonable choice is, so your Opus Thief deck is normally going to be Tymna and Kraum. And neither of those has a mana outlet. I think having both Smothering Tithe and Hull Breacher in your list, and Dockside Extortionist most likely as well, you have so many avenues for generating big mana that I think moving up into Kenrith instead, just to have an outlet for the mana to increase your percentage for being able to have some game should you somehow either get disrupted or whatever. I think that's going to be a profitable direction that people take the list. So either people expand and move into Kenrith, or people trim some of the white fat that they don't need and see what they can do just in the Grixis colors.
Yeah, I think there's still a pretty strong draw to playing Tymna Kraum, just because you get both of the card advantage engines in the command zone. And Kraum in particular, like compared to Kenrith, is kind of like a more mana efficient way of actually drawing additional cards. He's kind of a bit better outside of like the infinite mana, like Seedborn Muse, kind of like slow grindy scenarios at drawing you additional cards, because he doesn't really ask you to put any mana into him. He just kind of has to sit around for you to passively gain card advantage. And then, Tymna is just Tymna. So I do think that I agree insofar as white and, splashing into white and playing Tymna and Kraum becomes less, let's say, critical. Grixis wheel type decks, like Opus Thiefy type decks, disruptive wheel decks, let's say, get a leg up. Because those types of decks are really just looking for like A plus B wheel plus payoff type effects, and This is one of them, and this is one of the best that we've seen thus far. So I agree insofar as this does make Grixis look a little bit better. It also makes I also agree that it makes white less crucial to that type of strategy. Where I'm not 100% sure I agree is on whether this pushes you into Kenrith. Certainly that's a direction you can take, and I think that that's like totally valid, and like I think that is a deck, so I don't disagree with you, but I think that where a lot of people will probably look first is going to be something like Thrasios File Smasher, which is just like sans white, because like kind of as you said, right, we no longer really need white for this type of strategy, and we kind of just want that sync in the command zone. Thrasios is a little bit better at doing that, and you still get to keep all the breach lines and everything like that. Thrasios Vial Smasher was already picking up quite a bit in popularity just because of breach.
Yes.
So I think that this is just another slam dunk for that type of deck. This also goes into CST, just because that deck was already kind of on the Notion Thief wheel plan,
Right.
and this is essentially, in certain respects, just a better Notion Thief. It's disruptive in the same way, and that's a big part of why you play Notion Thief. Thrasios converts treasures into cards, but at the end of the day, you're mostly interested in comboing this with your wheel effect to strip everyone's options.
Well, and we're going to talk about this card coming up. One thing that I definitely see it fitting into as well is with the new partner Malcolm. One thing that I've seen people working with, well, people being myself, is I'm people, a Timna Malcolm like hate bears list that really tries to take advantage of the Hull Breacher, the opposition agent, all these different things. And I think there's definitely a deck there. And when I saw Hull Breacher, because at first I saw Opposition Agent and I was like, oh boy. And then I saw Hull Breacher and I'm like, oh, not only is it make you treasure there, but if you attack with it and hit somebody in the face, it also makes you treasure there. And if you're pairing that with Timna, you're also going to be getting some card advantage. And I just think that is a way that you could make a really, I don't know necessarily stacksy, but a grindy hate bears deck. You guys, we talked about this in the last episode. We were all talking about Kenra stacks. I love the decks that just are like, I'm going to make this game slow and I'm going to get this game miserable for everybody. And we're going to play an hour-and-a-half game here.
I'd be interested in your opinions on, so these two cards that we've just looked at are both going to impact the meta. They're both going to they're going to exert a force on deck building designs in the metagame. And with the kind of the punishment that is presented by getting caught with an opposition agent, if people will reduce the number of tutors, especially if there's an incentive to focus game plans around big draw instead. And when I say big draw, it's either, treasure-based Thrasios or Kenrith kind of draw engines in the command zone, and or wheels with profitable effects that they can, A plus B assemble.
I could definitely see that. Especially because we're seeing a lot of incentive to, I don't know necessarily play less tutors, but be more mindful with your tutors.
Right.
And I think what that's going to do is slow the pace of the game way down. Because that fear of getting blown out, we talked about this before, you're going to get blown out once by opposition agent and then never do it again. Presumably, I would hope so. But what I really think is it's going to slow gameplay down, and a lot more of these decks that are either going to be mid-range focused. I honestly think it makes CST the best deck in the format, because CST is like grindy, sandbaggy anyway. So they just introduced a couple, hey, here's some stuff to grind and sandbag with, and that deck's just like, oh, okay, that's cool. So, that's kind of my take on it. Is I definitely do think there will be this proliferation of decks like Opus Thief, where we're going to see more of that. But I also think that we're going to see some to combat that. And we're already kind of seeing that with our decks that we just talked about, where we're also already trying to go after these turbo Nas lists, right? And those are in a different way the same thing, right? So
can you explain
I think
that a little bit?
Well, I mean, so you're not doing big card draw in card draw per se, right? But you're still effectively drawing big cards,
Okay,
right?
I see what you're saying.
So Turbo Nas in my mind is doing the same thing in a way that Opus Thief is doing, but with a different way of getting there. They both end up doing very similar things outside of maybe like the way they take advantage of wheels, right? But they're both like, we want to pick up our decks and then we're going to win. Like that is the goal. Sure. And so we're kind of already seeing this movement into, we're just going to jam this out. And so I don't think it's unreasonable at all to assume that Opus Thief stocks go way, way, way up.
What do you think, Pongo?
I feel like I'm quickly settling into a certain role in this podcast, and that's the role of the pessimist at the table.
Sounds like a stacks player.
Yeah, I actually think I disagree with both of you on this. I think that this is not going to actually slow down the meta. I actually don't think that either of these cards are really cards that you particularly want to play in slower decks. I think that they both have like strong proactive applications. Hull Breacher in particular is a card that you want to like actively combo with wheel effects. And if you're only playing it kind of as a hate bear, it's not as at its best there. Similar to Notion Thief. You know, you can make an argument that it's a little bit better at 3 mana at doing that, but I still don't think that, you know, that's necessarily impactful enough on the game for you to want to be, you know, jamming that out as your like earliest disruption, let's say. You know, going
to be
beyond
clear,
that,
though, the question that I was asking was, do you see Opus Thief like decks taking a larger market share of the metagame?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll get to that, but I think that all this is important context for my opinion on that. So I still see the meta getting faster, actually. I think that the old adage, you know, classic Magic adage that, you know, you have to make them have it is going to continue to hold true for cards like Opposition Agent. You know, you can't just be too shy and play around it forever. And, you know, if your opponent's bluffing it, you can't play around it necessarily forever. People are still going to try to go for the win. People will get blown out in certain cases, obviously, when they do in fact have it, but it's one card in their 98 or 99. They can't always they can't always have it. Right. And you can't play scared all the time. You know, when you have the luxury to play around it, sure, that's great. You can play around it, but in many situations, I think you're going to lose percentage points by respecting it too much. So, you know, to return to your question about Opus Thief-like decks, it kind of depends on how you define what an Opus Thief-like deck is. If we're primarily talking about a sort of mid-rangey disruptive wheel combo deck, I've played that deck before, and I don't actually feel that, at least in the current meta, it's the best way to build that type of deck, that kind of 4-color like Grixis X deck or just Grixis deck. You know, in particular, playing like things like board wipes and stuff like that alongside your wheel-based combos. I really think that there's a stronger incentive than ever for those types of decks to be playing a faster game plan, a more explosive game plan, rather than a mid-rangey game plan. And so I guess my answer is it depends, right? So if you take all of like the turbo decks, you know, that are like Crom, Tymna based, or that are comboing with wheels, and you lump them all together and you call them all Opus Thief, then sure. But if you have a little bit more granularity and you look at Opus Thief as like one specific deck, with, like I said, that specific sort of mid-rangey wheel disruption game plan, as opposed to a more sort of like aggressive Grixis Nas type game plan, then then no, I don't necessarily think that there's going to be a major uptick in that type of deck.
I guess for my to clarify with my take, and this might come off really snarky, not necessarily to you, but just in general, is my experience is good players, I think, and this is going to sound kind of mean, good players will just make you have it, right? I think like Hermit Druid is a really good example of this. Hermit Druid players who are good will look you in the face, slam it on the table, and go and watch you for a turn cycle and go, you can either deal with this now or you can't. And if you can't, I'm winning. As somebody who played the Kenrith Druid Breach deck and really came up with a lot of the stuff in that, that is a very like way you play. But that is somebody who knows what they're doing, knows the deck pretty well. If somebody who, and what I expect to see is people who are just like, okay, so I'm looking at the cEDH database. Okay, here's Shaper's list. Okay, I'm going to throw this together. Oh, I don't have this card. I don't have that card. I'm going to kind of throw it together. In like local metas, I absolutely will see people being terrified to cast into an opposition agent. I mean, especially like and I'm not saying you're wrong necessarily, but I think the players who are less experienced with the deck will be much, and less experienced in cEDH in general, will be much more gun shy about it and are going to be, more cautious with that, especially because opposition agent has such a big penalty attached to it. So that's my kind of thought process with that, if that makes any sense.
So to be clear, I think agree with what I'm saying, which is that people will only respect it when they have the luxury to do so, and otherwise the old adage of make them have it holds true.
I think that's true.
Yeah, I do agree with that, and my point is really more specifically that I think that there are going to be a lot of players who are less experienced with it and are picking these things up for the first time, because we are seeing a big shift where people are really picking up cEDH for the first time, and they're going to be terrified of this card, of opposition agent specifically. But I could we've talked about these two cards for 40 minutes, so
I mean, yeah,
there's just so much to talk about.
It's like pretty interesting because I'm imagining like a meme template where you've got like small brain like jams at every possible opportunity new to the game, like medium brain waits for like the appropriate window to go off, like respects opponents having counter magic too much. Big brain, which is like returns to jam at every possible opportunity, and then finally you get to the actual galaxy brain, which is like knowing what your opponents have in their hand at all time, like better than they actually know what they have in their hand, and picking windows effectively. So yeah, definitely, I think that there's like an evolution to that heuristic that people will apply as they get better at the game. And I guess that's what I'm getting at in a roundabout kind of way.
No, I totally agree. So, and not to stop, but we have lots of cards to talk about, and we talked about 2 for 40 minutes. So the next card on our list, we kind of touched on our last episode, is Jeweled Lotus, which if you've been sleeping under a rock and not paying attention to any of the spoilers, first of all, congratulations. Second of all, so what Jeweled Lotus is it is quite literally Black Lotus, but only for commanders. It's a 0 mana artifact. You can sacrifice Jeweled Lotus, tap sacrifice, add 3 mana of any one color, and spend this mana only to cast your commander. So, Pongo, you're one of the Najeela guys. This is an auto-include in Najeela, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have the benefit of webcam to see my face, but like I'm just smiling as you read off this card pretty much, and as you ask me,
This card literally just reads, "Have a turn 1 Tymna."
Yeah, no, it's great with like any of the 3 or 4 CMC commanders. I mean, it's great even with 5 CMC commanders. I think people actually underestimate like how many places this goes and how good it can be in a lot of situations. In particular in Najeela, there's such a strong benefit of getting a turn 1 Najeela that I think that more than any other deck in the format probably benefits from this card. That might be a bit of a hot take, but turn 1 Najeela is that strong. I've kept so many sketchy hands that just have Mana Crypt in them because of like, oh, if I draw a land here, like this hand is absolutely stupid, and like I'm almost like assured to win. Jeweled Lotus, you just have the Jeweled Lotus in your hand and you
You're
get
like, oh,
there.
cool.
Yeah, I mean, like it's to the point where I've even like gone in the Najeela server and I've been like, do we play Gamble now just so we have like one extra like Jeweled Lotus opener possibility? I don't know that we'll go that far, but like it's certainly something to consider. So yeah, this card is nuts on turn 1. In Najeela in particular, it can be great if you have to recast Najeela because it turns out people try to remove her pretty often. So it's not even dead later on necessarily. And why it really shines in that deck is turn 1 you play Najeela just off the Jeweled Lotus, but then you're also potentially holding up mana turn 1 and turn 2 with interaction. And the thing about Najeela is that with Najeela in play and that deck's density of tutors, you're pretty much always ready to win if you can actually get a foothold on the board. So turn 1 Najeela means that turn 3 you're ready to go, and you're almost always gonna have the tutor to find Derevi for that situation. So super, super powerful.
Well, and I talked about this in my episode with Nathan Jones, where we were talking about this game or this card in particular. And one of the things we touched on is that this really makes turn order very, very, very important, even more so than it was. I believe who was it who did that study where it was like who the stats on who won the game the most often.
That's a project that's been done by a few different people, but most recently that I can think of is the Metagame project by Squirrel Mob, which you can find on the competitive EDH subreddit pretty easily.
Yeah, but they found that whoever started first, the stats were skewed towards them winning more often than it wasn't. I think this card is going to push those stats even farther in that direction. I don't think it's going to make a lot of non-games. I think it's going to increase them. But, I mean, it's obviously you're going to be able to drop a turn 1 Najeela. That's pretty damn good, right? Like, that's really good. And there are other cards that you can drop on turn 1. There's things like Godo, Gitrog, Urza. I mean, all the list goes on and on and on. And so this card just really pushes a lot of those things. And Cobblepott, I knew, so you and I, because when we were talking about it on Discord, our initial response to this was, what the hell? But you kind of had some reasoned thoughts with it the longer we looked at it. So what really was it that you're seeing with this? So
I agree with the points that both of you have already illustrated. For let's say commander-oriented lists, so Najeela, Gitrog, Godo, where your priority is to get your commander onto the battlefield as early as possible. This is absurdly good. It's incredible. A turn 1 Godo is much stronger than I think people realize how good that is. And it's even for lists that want their commanders kind of as a peripheral part of their engine. So, Tymna lists, the Thrasios lists, those kind of things, being able to, accelerate them onto the board as well is dramatic. That said, I don't think it shifts, the metagame around. I think there might be some lists that you don't see currently that might get the boost that they need.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some people, whispering about Brago, trying to get Brago because you can get turn 1 Bragos, more reasonably with this and that kind of thing. Lists that were good a while ago, but because they're commander centric and they're just, a turn or two slower than everybody else, some of those lists may wind up getting elevated to playability with the help of this.
This makes Grand Arbiter significantly better.
It can, yes, absolutely. A turn 1 Grand Arbiter is also very difficult, especially a turn 1 seat 1 Grand Arbiter is, like you were saying, the turn order winds up becoming extremely pertinent in those cases. But that said, for lists where your commander is not your number 1 priority, like we were talking about Kenrith before and that kind of thing, I don't know. I don't know if that's the, depending on the type of game plan that you're wanting to play, if you're not expecting a lot of challenge in keeping your commander on the board, if people aren't sniping your commander every single time that they hit the battlefield, pulling this off the top deck at the end of the game when your commander's already in play and you don't have partners, that's going to feel real bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it goes in every deck, and I don't think that it is something that becomes a boogeyman of the format.
I think this definitely goes in every monocolored deck, though.
I think it goes into, even a fair few, like more sort of, let's say, like bottom-up design decks, decks that may not be necessarily totally commander reliant. Broadly speaking, I agree with what Cobblepott said. But I think the fact that, first of all, it's a 0 drop, means that it doesn't hurt you whatsoever on your ad nause curve. It has pretty strong synergies even in these sort of bottom up, again, sort of like Turbo Nause style decks where you often do want to cast your commander so that you can sacrifice it to Culling the Weak or Diabolic Intent. If we look at a deck like Rograk where you might want to like recast him, this handles doing that as well. Mm-hmm. So while I do agree that it doesn't go everywhere, and I actually do agree with the more general thesis that I don't believe it becomes a boogeyman of the format, I do think that it's going to be surprising how many kind of unintuitive places it might end up.
Well, just a reminder, this is a Black Lotus. Yes, you can only spend it on your commander, but 3 free mana is not bad. You know what I mean? Like there are very few situations where I can really think that 3 free mana is a bad thing. I've seen people compare this to very hyperbolically to Dark Ritual, and obviously this isn't quite that. But this is really just a card that is going to make these commander-centric, like you said. But also, honestly, I really agree with what your take there, Pongo, because what we're really talking about is a card that, think about with like a Timna Crom. We're talking about, realistically, you could get a turn, 1 or 2 Crom. That's big. Timna Crom is not commander-centric, and that deck, if you could slam Crom on turn 1, you're in a great place.
That's a hand you'll frequently keep. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not going to ship that one.
Yeah, but and now you mentioned Rogue Rack. Is that how I'm supposed to say it? I'm just going to call him Roger.
Yeah.
And he is 0 mana. He's a red creature. He is a legendary Kobold warrior who has First Strike, Menace, Trample. He's a 0/1. And partner. And so when you first kind of look at this thing, you just kind of go, what? It's a 0/1 with First Strike, Menace, Trample, whatever. Then you kind of think about all the crazy stuff that it enables. a litany of things come to mind. First of all, it makes Mox Amber significantly more playable, which I am all about. It makes, Cobblepott, you had brought up Springleaf Drum.
Yeah.
It makes those, if you control your commander spells, insane. You can sack it to Culling the Weak, which you had mentioned, Pongo. I mean, the card is bananas. So what I'm really interested in is like what our take on this is, because, you know, we've talked a lot about like Boogeyman, and this is not obviously going to be a Boogeyman, but this is going to change the look of what is on the database right now. Like, this is going to be a big card that's going to see a lot of play.
Yeah, hashtag ROG is POG. For everyone out there who's listening, you know, who might hang out in, you know, specific Discords and stuff like that. Yeah, so this card is insane, and I agree that it doesn't look like it at first. You know, it's a 0 mana 0/1, and then it has a bunch of combat based abilities. So, you know, like, you know, with 0 power, it's funny to have First Strike and Menace and Trample. I love the design of this card. Like, I do too. It's
hilarious.
Great.
It's a great design.
It's an amazing card. I don't think Wizards could have ever possibly imagined how degenerate we would get with this card.
Right.
Or maybe they did. And
no, they had no idea. There's no
they
way
did not.
They thought
Nobody
this was
had the
be a
foresight
cEDH
to see
staple.
this.
But I love this card. A good friend of mine actually DM'd me asking me, are you going to play this card in Najeela? And I was like, you know, because you play this on turn 1, right? And you attack with it when Najeela comes down.
And it's a warrior, right?
And it triggers Najeela, so you get a 1/1. So, like, it theoretically does take a turn off your clock. And I was like, well, but the problem there is that he's a 0/1. He's a 0/1. So, yeah, Rograg is Roger is meant to die. Let's put it that way. He's meant to die. He's not meant to die in combat, really. That being said, I'm looking at him again. And I'm like, he has Menace too? That means that he can't actually be blocked that easily?
Right.
So he doesn't die in combat? What is even happening? Yeah, this card is
so
insane.
silly.
But he doesn't trigger Derevi.
He does not trigger Derevi, but he creates a warrior just when he attacks, and that's kind of the appeal. But yeah,
I'm gonna spoil this decision for everybody. Don't play that in Najeela.
Yeah,
it is a bad idea.
It's not exactly like high enough card quality. I'm playing other cards that are experimental that do something somewhat similar to playing a 0 mana 0/1 in some ways, but is also just like way better. Final Fortune tech, you know, being like essentially time walking is I think better than having a 0 mana 0/1 for that deck in particular, but that's some experimental spice. So essentially, yeah, this card is crazy. As you mentioned before, you have all these synergies with free spells, you have all these synergies with cards that want you to sacrifice something to get some kind of, you know, disproportionate beneficial effect. You know, typically a lot of black cards do that. Even some red cards do that. You know, sacrifice for power. Either it's mana or it's for tutoring, stuff like that. You know, there's also cards that we're getting and we're going to be talking about after that, you know, care about your commander being in play yet again. And again, anytime we get any card like that, having a 0 mana commander that instantly makes that a possibility, you know, this card can only kind of get stronger from that perspective, because if we design cards for commander, chances are there's going to be some, you know, chances are they're going to continue using the mechanic where that card gets stronger if you control a commander, because it's a great way to balance cards power level wise so that they're not abusively strong in non-commander formats, but they do some silly things in our format. So
God, if this thing sees play in Legacy, I will eat my shorts. I swear to God.
Well, the problem is he's legendary, so he's not as good as the other kobolds in, you know, some of like the kobold-oriented Legacy decks. So, you know, that's again one way you can balance a card for 60 card formats.
So if you really want to know the real meme with this card, right, is I don't remember if I've brought this up on an episode yet or not. So one of my favorite cEDH decks that I've ever played, and still really greatly enjoy playing, is Joyra Storm. And this this card triggers Joyra. It's a free cantrip.
Oh wow!
In that deck. So I mean, like, this card is silly on so many levels. I could see an argument where, first of all, if you have not played Joyra Storm, I absolutely recommending that deck. It's not great against meta stuff, yada yada yada. It is fun. You have never lived until you have been hellbent, and then you top deck a mana vault and then proceed to win the game. That is the greatest feeling.
Yeah, I've seen it.
And so this is obviously a card that like Garda are going to be talking about playing in Joyra for sure. But there's also Cobblepott, you've mentioned this, some tech that you can do with Dockside Extortionist and Cloudstone Curio.
Right. So people are looking at a couple of different infinite mana kind of loops that you can have, and the main one is you Dockside Extortionist with Cloudstone Curio, and that's already an existing combo that's used in some places where you have a 1 mana dork that you cast, and then when it comes into play, then it triggers Cloudstone and you bounce Dockside, and then as long as Dockside is producing 4 mana, so that you're netting a mana with each loop, you're spending 2 on Dockside and 1 on the dork, and you got 1 left over, then that's going to be mana positive for you. This, because he's 0 mana, makes it so that you only need 3 mana to go mana positive, and there's almost never going to be a time that you're not going to have that present on the board through your opponent's board states. So it's very, very likely to be live at any point in the game, and the fact that part of it is in your command zone, it winds up being really good. So you're pairing this guy up with either something like Silas, it's doing the standard things that Grixis does well, or you're pairing it up with Thrasios, so you're in Teamer, and it's giving you your outlet in the command zone for being able to make use of that and go infinite.
Yeah, so that, I think you really hit the nail on the head with that discussion of either playing Grixis or playing Teamer Rug. So as far as Grixis is concerned, the Turbo Naz land, this is because of all these extra rituals that you get, your consistent Mox Amber, your consistent Culling the Weak, your consistent Diabolic Intent, among other things. This is a turbo deck that is, it's a fraction of a turn faster than the turbo decks that we already have in terms of its sort of average Goldfish, which is already a big deal because these are decks that, consistently win turn 3 and win on turn 2 quite often. And this deck, it has way more average hands that will win on turn 2. And now it has, kind of mediocre hands that will win on turn 3. And if you're not able to get there on turn 2 and turn 3 with your hand, then you mulligan it.
Right. And you can't overstate how strong either Fierce Guardianship or Deflecting Swat is from turn 1. Yeah. Having that live, because a lot of people will have one of those cards in hand, and they'll look at, do I keep this because this might not be live? If you're playing, a Tymna deck or something that where you're not likely to get your commander out until maybe turn 2 or turn 3, those cards aren't as good in those circumstances. Where if you know that they're guaranteed to be good every game, starting from turn 1, you can't overstate how powerful that is in keeping other people off of their game plans and also protecting your own. It's
Absolutely.
It's huge.
One thing, and we just got to acknowledge this. We have to, rip Paradox Engine right now.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not sad.
Oh
now that
man,
I'm thinking
I'm sad.
about that.
That would have busted this card wide open.
I mean, it's already busted wide open. So
yeah,
it just would have made it worse.
I I mean, to return to this, Grixis versus Temur thing, in Temur, obviously you have the potential to be playing like Dockside, Cloudstone, Dockside plus Cloudstone Curio combos, as Cobble alluded to. But another thing that this card enables really powerfully is like the Divergent Transformations style of decks, where you just transform into a Tidespout Tyrant, and you always have a 0-drop.
Oh my god.
Which is like super amazing because the problem with those decks historically has been that you need a creature so you can transform into your big payoff, your Tidespout or whatever.
And you also need something that's generally going to be, like a 0-mana artifact or something like that to be able to repeatedly
get started.
Yes.
Yeah. And so this actually solves multiple problems. So you kind of, kind of took the words out of my mouth there.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Hopefully the people listening had kind of a similar thought process and, similar mind equals blown reaction there. But the idea here being that, you have Roger that you pay 0 mana for, you play him, you can sacrifice him to transform into a Tidespout Tyrant, let's say. And now for just, 2 mana, from your command zone, you can kind of start going off with a rock. And once you bounce Roger back to your hand, he's only 0 mana from that point on. That's the important interaction there. So, you'll get him out of the command zone for the 2 mana the first time, but then when, you have a free rock, like a Mana Crypt or something like that, you just bounce that, you bounce Roger, and you're just going off. Right. You're making infinite colorless mana, and then you hopefully make infinite colored mana so you can play your Thrasios and win. And that's that deck.
Yep.
Guys, I want to play Joyra again. I actually think in Joyra, when you brought this up, I think I could make a really good argument for slotting in Cloudstone Curio into Joyra now.
Should you Tidespout Tyrant? Have you been listening? You just do a Divergent
No, I know.
List.
I mean, I'm just like looking at this and thinking about all the stuff that this enables, and I'm just like, good God. I mean, I actually, maybe this is a really hot take. This is actually probably a really hot take. I think Joyra is moderately more playable now.
Is
well, with Black Lotus too.
Is the hot take that she was playable? I'm not sure that I pick up on the hot take.
I don't know, the hot take that her stocks are going up.
Yeah, I don't think that's a hot take.
I think, well, first of all, I think Joyra got some new toys in general with Jeweled Lotus and Hull Breacher. And I think this just is a cantrip, for crying out loud. And there's just, I love this card on so many freaking levels. And my favorite part about it is I'm getting a version of this commissioned. That's going to have Rogers from American Dad, his face plastered over Rograk.
Very nice.
So I am very excited for that. The next card is another red card, not a kobold, but is in the family, is a goblin wizard. It's Kirk the Thumbless. We finally got Kirk on a card.
Minus 2 thumbs.
He doesn't have, he only has 1 thumb.
Right? Oh, he's got no thumbs. He's thumbless.
That's right. Oh yeah, that's right. So Kirk the Thumbless is 1 colorless and red, legendary goblin wizard. He's a 2/2, and when you cast Jesus, this card. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, return that spell to its owner's hand. If you win the flip, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the spell. Oh, and this also has partner.
Yep.
Cobblepott. You just break down all the bananas stuff that you can do with this.
So at 2 mana, this is a really, really powerful effect. And with they had the release notes come out for the set that clarified one of the things that people were unsure about, and that's having to do with if you win the flip and you get to copy, but the spell is no longer on the stack for any reason, it still remembers what the spell was and still gives you a copy of it. And so you can have the original spell get countered and still then get copied. But something that's even more wacky is that if you have multiple Krarks on the battlefield through whatever copying mechanisms you've got, where you can create a copy that doesn't care about the legendary rule, and we'll get to that soon. Each of those Krarks will see the original triggering spell that was cast, regardless of whether it's still there. So let's say that you've got 3 Krarks on the battlefield, and you cast an instant. So you'll get 3 triggers that'll go on the stack. And then if that first one loses its flip and returns the spell back to your hand, those other 2 are still live and they can still make copies, even though that original spell is no longer on the stack. So what winds up happening is you get these situations where even just with 2 of them, so if you have 2 Krarks, then you got a 50% chance of the spell behaving like the ultimate of Tamiyo, where, I don't know if you remember the original Tamiyo, there was the 5-mana blue planeswalker, where the ultimate was when you cast a spell, put it back in your hand. Basically, this is what it'll do 50% of the time. A quarter of the time, it'll just give you 2 copies of it, and then a quarter of the time, it'll just come back to your hand in that circumstance. But, I mean, that on its own is bonkers, and then when you have more than 2 Krarks, it becomes even crazier. But let's say that you're not copying Krarks, and you're just using a single Krark on the battlefield. This makes the instant free interaction, like Fierce Guardianship or Deflecting Swat, or what's the black one that's
Deadly Rollick?
Deadly Rollick.
Yes.
Any of those spells.
Smog Salvage.
Right. And anything that doesn't
I forgot
involve
the green one exists.
Right. Anything that doesn't involve card disadvantage, like Force of Will or whatever, where you have to exile a card. Any of the cards where you can just kind of cast it without paying any mana. If you lose the flip, it just goes back to your hand and you can cast it again. So it basically becomes all upside for those cards. So if somebody has their win con on the stack, you can say, I'm going to Fierce Guardianship. Oh, nope, it came back to my hand. No, I'll cast Fierce Guardianship. Nope, it's back up to my hand. Here, oh, look, now I've got 2 Fierce Guardianships, both targeting your win con. So that dimension right there is already crazy. But I think that the one that really, really stands out is with Underworld Breach. So when you've got Underworld Breach and you're live with Underworld Breach, if you have the negative case of your spell going back to your hand, well, now it's back to your hand. It's not in your graveyard anymore. So you can cast it without incurring the what's the keyword for escape. Thank you. So you don't have to escape the cards in those circumstances, right. Or you just get 2 copies of it, and then you can just keep on escaping and so on. But it winds up having some applications that are just really, really bonkers from kind of like an old school Storm point of view.
It is very much a traditional Storm type of card. And actually, outside of cEDH, I could see an argument for wanting to play this in like Legacy Storm.
I could see that, especially if you're actually playing Storm cards.
Right.
There were in the old days when people were doing Adnaz and Tendrils and whatever. If they needed to double up on their Tendrils, they would run Remand. And they would cast Tendrils and then remand it back up to their hand, get all the copies on the stack, and then the card back in hand and be able to cast it again.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And he's giving that to you, kind of for free as a static ability that's always on the battlefield. Yeah,
I mean it's unsubs, which is what this is unsub, but you can make it better potentially.
Sure.
So I just think this card has a lot of applications in a lot of different areas.
Bonus round.
So Phoenix brought that up in our group chat, and I really don't want to think of how that stack looks like.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Because it kind of makes me want to pass out.
I think this is probably going to be the most fun deck in the format.
Oh,
for sure.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, like I think that goes without saying. It might not be the best cEDH deck in terms of performance, but it's going to be the most fun deck in all of EDH, I think.
Yeah, you'll have a blast piloting this. Honestly,
it
you'll
is.
probably have a blast playing against it too.
Right.
So what are the shells that we're looking at with this? Because it has partner. So right away we're thinking, blue. You want to see blue with this thing, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another one of those. You can run it in just kind of a standard Grixis list, and keep him tucked away for most of the game. And if you wind up starting a breach line, you bring him out, and then he improves your stats on all of your breach lines. Or you can, I think people were doing something in Teamer with him as well, just because you can go very mana positive with rituals in a Teamer shell, and then you've got Thrasios as an outlet for all of that mana. And the one that we'll get to in a minute is it, where you're pairing him up with the new Sakashima and doing the Krark tribal, where that is you look at it on its face, and that's a pun on 1,000 faces. But you look at it on its face and you're like, what is going on here? But the more Krarks that you have on the table, and there's these circumstances. So this list is running Dual Caster Mage. So people might be familiar with using Dual Caster Mage with like Twin Flame or Heat Shimmer or whatever, where those are instant spells that let you, or instants or sorceries that put a copy of a creature onto the battlefield and give it haste, and then it goes away at the end of turn, and you create a loop with Dual Caster Mage where it keeps on making copies of itself, which then copy that spell, and so on and so forth. You can create copies of Krarks. If you've got a sufficiently loaded bonus round that you've got going, where you get like 5 copies of any spell that you cast, you get 5 more copies of Krarks, and then like keep on looping. There's just really, and like Pongo was saying, all right, this is not going to lead the format in the cEDH tournament scene, but it's really, really interesting, and it's playable in cEDH. It's absolutely going to be able to be an active member of the cEDH scene that's taking place.
You can hang. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a meme that is worth exploring deeper.
Oh my, yeah. So I'm excited for it.
My only concern with this card is I don't really understand how he can flip coins without thumbs.
Oh my gosh.
Who's got no thumbs and can't flip a coin? This guy. You can't see me, but I'm holding up 2 fists.
Oh no, the flavor.
I might have just ruined the card for everyone.
Yeah, sorry.
One thing I've been thinking about the whole time we've been talking about these last 2 cards is all of a sudden Silas Wren's stocks just went straight up. Right? Like, we went from being like, who wants to play that card, right? And then all of a sudden we're just like, man, we're going to play Silas with this, and we're going to do this and this and this. And it's just like...
Right, this is the first time that we've got really compelling mono-red partners, so...
Well, it's the first time we've got mono-colored partners, period.
We've just gotten a lot of really good red cards, period.
Yeah.
That's true. Red definitely shines in this set. But before we move on, this is definitely something that I want to touch on. This is a thing that we've talked about, because you can't exist in cEDH and not see people go, "Oh, they need to ban Tymna and Thrasios or ban the partners," right? And what I've said for 2 years is, you don't need to ban the partners. You need to print more that are also compelling and probably in one color, so that you can really make people get creative.
Strong white partners. That's what we need.
That didn't happen, unfortunately.
So the problem to partners
Watch out for
reducing
a chroma.
Deck diversity is to just make more partners so that we can get our deck diversity back.
Correct.
Right. Proliferate partners.
It's like when a joke is so bad that the farther you go with the joke, it eventually gets funnier.
Right.
So
It's like
with
overflow,
that being said,
flips back over and becomes funny again.
it's a family
speaking of
joke,
more
Family Guy
partners.
joke.
Yeah. Speaking of more partners,
Another partner, we've talked a lot about partners in this set, is Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. We've got a new Sakashima. He's originally from which part of
He's from Kamigawa, I think.
Yeah, I don't
originally.
remember which part of that block he was printed in, but he was in the Kamigawa block originally. But Sakashima of 1,000 Faces is 3 colorless and a blue, a legendary human rogue. He's a 3/1. You may have Sakashima of 1,000 Faces enter the battlefield as a copy of another creature you control, except it has Sakashima of 1,000 Faces' other abilities. And his other abilities are the legend rule doesn't apply to permanents you control, and partner, of course. The legend rule piece of that is pretty big, right?
Right.
We were talking about it with Krark, and we kind of explored all the crazy things that we can do with that, right? Another thing that people are talking about with this is pairing it with Tymna, and then you get 2 Tymnas. This has some pretty interesting, I don't know necessarily it's going to be very ubiquitous, but this has some pretty interesting possible things. Pongo, what are you thinking with this thing?
I mean, I think that idea has legs for sure. So essentially in the past, Tymna, you would occasionally see Tymna being partnered with Ishai, and you end up with an Esper partner pairing that way. And the idea there being that you're kind of playing like a bunch of small creatures, a lot of like sort of like these like curse catcher type effects. So you're essentially playing these kind of like tempo oriented creatures. You're drawing cards off of Tymna naturally. And then you're also playing a Ishai, which will kind of just be there getting, bigger and bigger, threatening people. And winning the game at a certain point just by beating down. And so that deck also plays extra turn effects because, when you're beating down with a Ishai, when you're drawing loads of cards with Tymna, again, you're kind of like an Edric deck where you don't necessarily need to get, infinite turns to win, or not even infinite turns, but like, an absurd amount of turns. Sometimes you just kind of will get there. This could kind of fill a similar role. And you could even theoretically go beyond it by playing like more hate bearer and stacks type effects. Because Sakashima naturally is going to, if it comes into play as a copy of Tymna, then you're just getting lots and lots of additional card draw. Or, you can use him just to double up on one of your stacks pieces. That can be really, really important. So I think that there's certainly room to explore these, Esper, Tymna, Sakashima type decks that are just going to look to kind of tempo people out that way.
Right. And I'm interested to see kind of where that goes. Another thing that we've kind of talked about with Tymna is Malcolm, the Kenaid. And I'm not sure, like, because I feel like with Sakashima, right, like it's all pretty straightforward, right? Cobblepott, like it copies a thing, you make the thing, right? Like, I mean, what else? Because we really kind of dove with it a lot with the Kirk, and that's kind of the big thing. Like, what else is with this?
So this is a card that, I mean, the original Sakashima is not too far different from this in the way that you're going to use it most of the time. And I would say the main places that you used to see the original Sakashima used were in Derevi decks to have to double up on all of the triggers, that's a very dramatic effect when you have 2 Derevis and you have 5 creatures on the board. Getting 10 triggers is insane. But the other place that you would see it was in Yuriko decks. It is fairly common to see Yuriko have Spark Double and the original Sakashima just to double up on the ninja triggers in a very similar way to what you do with Tymna. And I guess the key difference here is being able to have be in your command zone with
Right.
Tymna. I can see the attraction there, and it then just means that Esper is an interesting. There aren't a lot of Esper decks that we have in the metagame right now that are popular. We see a lot of 4-color decks that contain Esper, but I mean you don't see Zur very often.
You don't see Amanatu very often.
Right. I'm struggling to think of an Esper deck that's solely Esper.
I mean,
that
those
we
are
see in
literally
Metagame.
the 2 decks on the database. There's Zur and
It's
Amanatu.
fallen off the map because you absolutely want to have red these days, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would be interested to see how those decks pan out, because being a Yuriko player myself, I know how dramatic it can be to double up on those Edric style card draw effects in aggressive decks. So I know that can be powerful, and whether it is going to be enough to be able to contend with the blisteringly fast and getting faster under Roger and some of these other kind of, these Grixis lists that are going to be threatening really fast Adnaz. If it's the right moment for that pairing to shine or not. So we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one last thing I wanted to mention about Sakashima that I didn't want to gloss over, because it's kind of an interesting point. For 4 mana, not only are you getting a clone effect, but you're also getting a one-sided mirror gallery. And so that mirror gallery makes all of your other clones potentially that much stronger.
Right.
Suddenly your phantasmal image can be a third Tymna. If you play this in like a Derevi style deck again, one of the other common things you would do with your Sakashima and Derevi is you would copy Grand Arbiter, because that's just so strong when you've got double Grand Arbiter, and your opponents are paying 2 extra for their spells, and your white and blue spells cost 2 less.
Right.
Now, theoretically, you get triple or quadruple Grand Arbiter. So there's a lot of potential power in this, kind of tacked on mirror gallery effect that I think, we'd be remiss not to mention.
Right. There's a tricky little rule question that comes up there, and this is another thing that I think we have to look into the rulings for the set. But when a clone copies a card, it copies the card itself. And when we're talking from a layering point of view, I don't know if a clone can copy Sakashima copying another card. And the reason why that's important is if you have Sakashima that's giving you your mirror gallery effect, that becomes a huge point of vulnerability for getting blown out. If you've got multiple like phantasmal images or something on the battlefield that are copying legendary permanents. So as soon as your mirror gallery goes away, then you also lose as a static effect all of the the tokens that are now violating the legend rule. And people were saying, well, you can get around it by having people, copy the Sakashima as something else. And I don't believe that that's a thing that you can do. So it's just a point of vulnerability people need to be aware of.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I'm not sure about that.
I want to say you can. And the reason I think that is, if you were to clone a phantasmal image, right? That's a clone of, I don't know, Gilded Drake, whatever. First of all, it doesn't target, so it won't trigger the ability, which is important. But the other piece to that is that immediately what you're going to see is it will also have the phantasmal image ability attached to it. Because that's part of the wording on the text, is it adds that ability. And so that's what it's doing here, except it has Sakashima of the 1,000 Faces other abilities. So I think that layer makes it so that the legend rule sticks around. I might be wrong. But I feel like that it would function similarly to Phantasmal Image.
Yeah, my understanding is that you ought to be able to copy Sakashima copying something else and expect to have a clone of the original target. I say target with parentheses around it. the original cloned creature, let's say. So that's my understanding of the rules. I am not a judge, and obviously, we have to wait and see for all the set notes before we can be 100% for certain.
Right.
But yeah, at least my intuition is that we should be able to copy Sakashima copying something else and have it work the way we would want it to work.
Right.
So potentially even stronger, and actually that's a really good point to consider, because it does mean that your play pattern should always be to copy the Sakashima and not copy the original thing if you want to have 3 copies of the same thing, because you do want to have the double mirror gallery effect.
Right, especially for the Kirk tribal list, because you don't want someone to shoot your Sakashima down and then lose all of your Kirks because,
right. So moving on to some of the other partners. God, we still have a lot more to go.